Welcome to What If, history that could have been. I've taught history for a long time, and I love history. I'm fascinated by the facts. But I'm also fascinated by the reality that other things could have happened. That history wasn't something laid down permanently and inevitably, and that it's really useful to stretch your mind to realize how much the present and the future could change by going back and looking at how history might have changed. So we're going to do a series on what could have happened. And the very first one we're doing is on Ronald Reagan and his famous speech in 1987 in front of the Berlin Wall. You know, Reagan had gone to the Berlin Wall as governor exactly 20 years earlier. At the time, he had a throwaway line. That wall sure is ugly. They ought to tear it down. Now, he's been elected president, and he was re-elected president, carrying all but one state. So in the full weight of the presidency, he was going back to Berlin. And remembering that line, he wanted to say, Mr. Gorbachev,
चिंता को तलवार की नोक पे रखे वो राजपूत, रेत की नाव लेकर समंदर से शर्त लगाए वो राजपूत, और जिसका सर कटे फिर भी धड़ दुश्मन से लड़ता रहे वो राजपूत।
At that point, he got a call from the president. He said, Georgie, you need to tell you that I'm the president. So when he landed in Berlin, at that moment, at breakfast, all of his seats were gone. The State Department was supposed to be with Sam Gorbachev. Some intelligence agency thought actually the Soviet Union was at least from the 30th year. His political advisors tried to tell it was absurd.
राजपूती कंगन में
Ironically,
ताकत है जितनी
2
राजपूती
days
तलवार
after
में।
Reagan's speech in the Washington Post, an op-ed writer pointed out that it was good that Germany was divided. It wasn't going to be united ever in the near future, and that we should all be glad it wasn't reunited. I don't know if that writer went back to correct themselves a few years later when Chancellor Helmut Kohl presided over the reunification of Germany. But I remember when the wall fell and East Berliners were running into West Berlin, and they were excited, and people were gathered singing and celebrating. And Sam Donaldson, the ABC reporter, went out to the ranch to interview former President Reagan. And he said to him, "Are you surprised that the Germans are so eager to be reunited?" And Reagan looked at him for a second in a way that only Reagan could. And he said, "Well, you know, Sam, I always thought they were all Germans. So it seemed to me pretty likely they'd all want to get together." Now, it seems to me it was a great case of Reagan knowing a lot more than the CIA, a lot more than that writer at the Washington Post, and a lot more than his senior advisors. But let me pose a different example. What if Reagan had caved? What if he'd looked at all of his senior advisors and said, "Well, all right, guys, if you really feel that way," didn't say the words, might or might not have changed how rapidly the wall came down. Probably the wall came down somewhat faster because of the Reagan speech, because President Reagan, Pope John Paul II, and Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher were engaged in a very aggressive campaign to break up the Soviet Empire and to liberate Eastern Europe. But it might not have come quite as fast. But there's a deeper reality to this. Ronald Reagan was a very stubborn man. Once he thought something through, once he believed in it, whether it was supply-side economics, cutting taxes in the 1980 campaign, and then hammering away at those tax cuts until he got them passed in 1981, or it was his meeting with Gorbachev in Iceland at Reykjavik, where Gorbachev, who was desperate to kill the American Star Wars anti-ballistic missile program, basically offered to give Reagan everything if he would just give up his defense system. And Reagan said no, he wasn't going to do it. And if you see a video of that time, they have a very angry argument as the meeting breaks up and they're standing by their two cars. And Reagan is saying to Gorbachev, you blew it. This was your mistake and you're going to regret it. 6 months later, Reagan got everything he wanted from Gorbachev while still keeping his anti-ballistic missile defense system, which was the base from which we today are protecting ourselves from North Korea. So I think the important thing to remember here is, in these alternative histories, a weaker Ronald Reagan, a Ronald Reagan who could have been edited by the State Department editors, a Ronald Reagan who would have caved to his senior advisors, would not have been the Ronald Reagan who recreated the American economic growth, who renewed American civic culture, and who defeated the Soviet Empire so that it collapsed shortly after his departure from office. And in that sense, this is an example. We're studying the difference between what would it have meant if there had been an alternative history. It teaches you a lot about the characters that really mattered. I hope you find this useful, and I hope you'll tell your friends about it. And I want you to know that you can go to the comment section and you can offer us ideas. What kind of history would you like to look at? What are some places where you'd like to consider alternatives? We'd love to talk about things that you care about, and we invite you to come to the comment section, and we invite you to tell your friends about this whole approach to what if, history as it could have been.